tarde a todos e todas. É um prazer imenso estar aqui. Meu nome é Ngaire Woods, estudo mestrado em Administração Pública, Políticas Públicas aqui na Blavatnik School of Governemnt, em Oxford. E estou muito feliz de introduzir esse último painel. Então, finalmente, agora chegamos a esse final, depois de tantas emoções, que é o Brasil visto de fora, qual o lugar do nosso país no mundo? O objetivo dessa mesa é discutir as mudanças no papel internacional do Brasil e as perspectivas para os próximos anos. Não é um tema fácil, mas é um tema super importante. Essa discussão trará pontos de vista da Universidade de Oxford e da London School of Economics and Political Science, que são as universidades parceiras, né, de reconhecimento mundial que fazem esse fórum acontecer. E a gente vai analisar a atual crise do papel do Brasil, que pode ser feito também para mudar nossa trajetória, pensando em organizações internacionais e multilateralismo. Eu gostaria agora de chamar dois panelistas que de fato dispensam apresentações, mas a gente vai apresentar assim mesmo, como fizemos todos os painéis. Primeiro, a reitora da Blavatnik School of Governemnt e professora de Governança Econômica Global da Universidade de Oxford, Ngaire Woods. A Ngaire tem um currículo muito extenso, pediu para não apresentar tudo, então só quero dizer que ela tem uma grande relevância no mundo e ela discute como melhorar a governança econômica e qual o papel das instituições internacionais neste processo, além dos grandes desafios do desenvolvimento global, e vai poder compartilhar um pouquinho aqui com a gente mais sobre isso. Muito bem-vindo, Ngaire. Em seguida, tenho a honra de apresentar o professor Miguel Angel Santos, da London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE, diretor do Growth Co-Lab, uma joint venture entre LSE e Harvard. Santos trabalha com um portfólio de pesquisas aplicadas para engajar e mobilizar governos, principalmente em países em desenvolvimento, para repensar suas estratégias e como fazer o desenvolvimento de fato acontecer. Por favor, Miguel. Por fim, mas não menos importante, gostaria de chamar ao palco Paula Razeira, mestrando em Administração e Políticas Públicas na LSE, com bolsa ative e da Fundação Lehman, gestora pública, alumna do Vetor Brasil, presidente da Brazilian Society e da LSE e principalmente nossa vice-presidente do querido Fórum Brasil UK. Por favor, Paula.
Boa tarde, gente. Tudo bem? Eu imagino que vocês já estejam um pouquinho cansados, então esse final ele vai ser um pouco mais curto. E também a gente gostaria de fazer um anúncio que, infelizmente, por algumas questões que saíram do nosso controle, a gente não vai conseguir fazer a tradução simultânea. Então esse painel ele vai ser realizado em inglês. Quem quiser, com acompanhamento de algum dos nossos alunos para fazer uma espécie de tradução do contexto geral do que está sendo discutido, a gente ofereceu alguns voluntários para isso. Alguém gostaria dessa ajuda? Alguém pode ajudar? Obrigada. Mais alguém? Então, agora eu vou começar em inglês, tá bom? Good afternoon, professors. It's an honor to have you here today. Well, to start our discussion, I would like to ask to you, what is Brazil's place in the world? Please, Maddie, can you start?
Starting with me. Okay, well, firstly, hello. I'm very sorry to be speaking in English, and thank you. It's a great indulgence on your part to let the one person in the room who doesn't speak Portuguese speak English. Thank you. I recognize that, and thank you. Second, a huge welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. I know for some of you, this is your second home, and for others, this is your first visit. I hope it's the first of a very large number of visits to the school. We're delighted to have you here. We're thrilled to have built over the 10 years of the school's life, we've built a stronger and stronger relationship with Brazil, with Brazilian students, with the Lehman Foundation, and with on different issues in Brazil. And we're particularly thrilled that the students of the LSE and of the Blavatnik School have organized such a fantastic two-day conference. So welcome. So Brazil, from where I sit, and again, I'm not only the only person in the room that doesn't speak Portuguese, I'm also the only person in the room who's not expert on Brazil. So I'm going to give you a view from outside of Brazil about how, as it were, the rest of us see Brazil. Because I think Brazil has an extraordinarily important and uncomfortable place right at the center of the fracture lines that are splitting the world politically and economically at the moment. So first, Brazil is a member of the G20. It's the 12th largest economy in the world. You all know that. But the G20, a grouping of states we all are going to rely on to deal with a triple crisis this coming year, is finding it almost impossible to reach agreement. Brazil's role in that group is absolutely vital. So that's the first thing I would say. Brazil on the world stage, using its very special diplomatic history and tradition to help the world cooperate. The second thing is Brazil's trade relationships and relationship to the world food system, which puts it right in the middle of these fracture lines. Because Brazil is the largest producer and exporter of soybeans, it is crucial to a world which now has a full-blown food crisis on its hands. As you all know, Brazil exports 2/3 of those soybeans to China. So Brazil relies on its market in China, and China relies on Brazil. Brazil imports 85% of the fertilizers which make that agriculture possible, and most of that is from Russia. So that puts Brazil right in the heart of the negotiations with Russia and with other trade partners and those who are trying to resolve the food crisis. So exporting soybeans to China, importing huge amounts of fertilizer from Russia, without which Brazil cannot continue to feed the world. And third, of course, Brazil's second largest export market is the United States, its northern neighbor. And coming shortly after that, of course, are Brazil's relationships with the European Union. So you can see that Brazil depends upon the 4 major power blocks in the world, and they also depend upon Brazil. And that puts Brazil in a very important place on the world stage, but it also means that the world stage is absolutely critical to Brazil, whatever happens in your forthcoming elections. The third element I would highlight is, which you've spoken about at length over these 2 days, is Brazil's role on climate, where obviously it's one of the world's largest carbon emitters, and at the same time, it's home to most of the Amazon, absolutely crucial for the world's management of climate change. That puts Brazil right at the center of world efforts to negotiate and move forwards on climate. And fourth and finally is Brazil's position on nuclear weapons. So Brazil and Argentina, as most of you know, are very special in the world because they are the most advanced in having precursors to make nuclear weapons. But they have not done that. They've relied on their own bilateral treaty of restraint. But in a world where Russia has invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine used to have nuclear weapons on its soil, many countries around the world are asking themselves, do we need a nuclear weapon to be safe? And again, Brazil's position on that issue is very, very important for the rest of the world, both its expertise, its knowledge, its history, and its position. And what happens in Brazil on that issue is going to be very important to the rest of the world. So I just wanted to start by laying out those 4 elements which make Brazil essential for the rest of the world, and what happens in the rest of the world absolutely essential to Brazil. I'm hoping that in our discussion, we can pick up on one further issue, and I won't take time now to raise it. But it is, to me, an extraordinarily important issue, and it's not one I usually speak about. And that's in the light of the recent US Supreme Court decision. It's just to think about the position of women and the autonomy of women, and whether or not women have a right have a set of rights over their bodies which begin with the right to be free from violence. Because that's the backdrop against which I think we have to think about the Supreme Court, not on their decision about abortion, but on their decision about what kind of liberty human beings have and where we go to look for that liberty. And there again, Brazil to me is absolutely central because it's one of the countries which has both the highest rates of violence against women on the one hand, and on the other, some of the most interesting and powerful experiments in preventing that violence and supporting women who are subjects to it. So to me, that's another really important issue that we could discuss today, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Please, Professor Miguel.
Thank you. Well, para começar, eu quero desculpar com vocês, porque eu vou falar em inglês. Infelizmente, meu português ainda não é bom o suficiente para mim falar português. So I'm going to switch to English. So we are two in the room, so you're not alone. I think Professor Woods covered really well the perspective from a more general standpoint. Given that I am from Latin America, I would like to just add a few things regarding the region. I am Venezuelan, the son of Spanish immigrants to Venezuela, like many of you might be, but in Brazil, of all the type of immigrants. And we always look up to Brazil, of course, like it's a giant of the region. And whenever we discuss something, it's what's Brazil doing? So for us, Latin Americans, this is a very, there's a lot of turmoil in the political arena nowadays. Many countries have been forced to choose between extreme right and extreme left. That's a very uncomfortable choice. The center has essentially disappeared in the region. And fortunately, I think the winners have been the less extreme in some countries, not in all, the less extreme. And I certainly hope that's the case of Brazil and the near elections as well. But I think Brazil as a beacon of human rights for the region, as the role of Brazil as a warrantor of democratic rights, human rights, political freedoms, free media, economic freedom, it's extremely, extremely important. The first government of Lula came at a time where the region was coming to a political switch from the right to the left, and it seemed necessary to reassert the left in the region. Since then, many things have happened, and the region seemed to have gone wild. And I think there's a good time now for Brazil to perform the role that it didn't perform between 2003 and 2010, which is a balance for the region, for us to discuss a true topic, true leadership, to compel other Latin American countries to face the real challenges they are facing, not only Brazilian ones, many of them are shared. But there are many challenges that are common and others that are particular to each region. Some of them have to do with human rights and political freedoms. And I think having Brazil on the right side, meaning the side of human rights and political freedom as a beacon for the region, it's very important. That's the first thing. And the second thing, also more micro, it's related to climate change. I happened to work 1 year in 2019, invited by the government of Iquitos, to think about a strategy to develop the Peruvian Amazonia. I don't think the challenge it's much different, although the Brazilian Amazonian is much more developed and has a much more sophisticated structure, economic structure, than the Colombian and the Peruvian Amazonian. But the question is the same. The question is, for the people living there, we need to be able to find a way to improve their standard of living in a way that is consistent with environmental equilibrium. Like I kept on finding people in Peru, and maybe that's the case in Brazil as well, that told us they came here to protect the environment, and in the process they built a wall between us and development. And I have never forgotten that, coming from the governor of the province. And I think if we don't want people, which we don't want, to take it upon the forest, We need to find a way to give them a way of living, of improving their standards of living away from the forest. And we did some work of that, and a reference in that work always is Brazil, what is Brazil doing, and politicians in the region wanting to develop the region at a significant environmental cost refer to examples of what is being done in Brazil. Look at Manaus. So I think Brazil needs to be conscious that it's not only when it makes a decision, it's not only Brazil, it's an example for the region, and people is looking up to. And I think in those areas, other than the ones that were previously mentioned, are the ones where I don't know if the world, I think what the world expects was well described before, but more like from Latin America. What would Latin Americans expect from Brazil? I think I would like to emphasize these two. I will give you credit on some minutes that I will use later, but just two remarks that I wanted to make to hit it off.
Thank you, Professor. Before opening to the questions to the public, I would like to make a second question. As you know, we will have presidential elections in October. And I would like to know that besides the results, what do you think that is happening with Brazil? Please, Professor Ngaire.
I'll let Miguel take it first.
Well, what has changed in the previous years is very important. I cannot help but thinking that Lula da Silva is headed to a new election in an environment that it's completely different to the one where he became president. He became president in a world with a significant, prolonged commodity super cycle, with prices booming from the year he took off exactly up to 2014. So there was an abundance, an environment of abundance. So that's the first thing. Second thing, he received an economy completely stabilized from an exchange rate standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a growth standpoint, after the 8 years of government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso. So he received an economy stabilized. And third, China was not a partner for Brazil in 2003. And much of the growth engine in the Lula period was because Brazil went to exporting 100 million a year to 65 billion to China. So if you look at Brazil exports to China, they boom from almost nothing to 65 billion nowadays. It's 5% of Brazilian GDP. So Brazil increased their market share in minerals, of the world market in minerals, in agricultural goods, by tapping into the Chinese market. So that's the context. So within that context, the policies were policies of abundance. So Lula went on a spending spree that reinforced growth. So there was some growth, but more important, there was a lot of consumption, because growth combined with an appreciated exchange rate resulted in something very technical that you will all recognize. Brazilians traveling around the world because it's extremely cheap to travel. So you met them all over the place. So there was a booming consumption facilitated by many social policies that spread the commodity boom through the rest of the economy. So there was some growth, poverty came down. Consumption grew a lot more than growth, than GDP. So there was a lot of imported goods in that consumption. And last, the minimum wage over the 8 years of Lula by 2010 was 50% above inflation over the 8 years. So he entered a policy of expanding public wage bill that was very significant. So that's the context. So the world today, the world, not for Brazil, the world today, it's a world where the world is entering a recession. Brazil grew the first quarter, somehow the second quarter is expected to enter a recession by the end of the year. Inflation is running at 12, 13%. Many of that inflation is imported. It was referred, it's a challenge. But in Brazil, there's a significant economic parameter that points out to persistence, which is when past inflation explains future inflation. So there's a lot of persistence and expectations in Brazil inflation, and the Central Bank of Brazil wanting to gain control of the policy, rise the interest rates, last time I checked, to 11.75%, which is a lot. So within that context, growth is coming down. There's a public deficit inherited from the COVID years that it's presumably now going to get worse because Brazil is giving a lot of energy subsidies to cushion the impacts of the huge increases in energy prices. So from a fiscal standpoint, there's no room for another party. And it's interesting, how would either winner deal with an environment that is an environment that has nothing to do with what was 10 years ago. Moreover, China's imports have plateaued. And that's a bill that Dilma Rousseff somehow had to pay because China stopped increasing its imports from Brazil in 2015. And they have stagnated since then. So that's not going to be a source of growth for Brazil anymore. So that will force the country, and I can talk later about that, to face its own challenges. And I know some of you believe that God is Brazilian, but it's not. So this situation has a good thing. It's a blessing in disguise. It will force Brazil to look at its core challenges and get people together the same way you got together here, multidisciplinary people from different spectrum of society, to talk about how can we deal with this problem. And there are external challenges, of course, but there are also a lot of internal challenges that need to be dealt with. And we can talk more about that in the next session. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
I think what I would say is more about the politics. I was in Brazil just before the election which brought Bolsonaro to power, and I met with each of the other presidential candidates. And it struck me that Brazil, like so many other countries in the world, Brazilians were very tired after a decade since the financial crisis, and were looking for a transformative politics, which would do something for their livelihoods, for security, for their sense of safety, and for their hopes for the future. And that, in a way, Bolsonaro rode that wave into politics. But what we've seen over the last few years is the other part of the wave that Bolsonaro has ridden, which is to erode, to break, to smash the institutions that actually make a democracy possible. You know, obviously, democracy is not majoritarian rule. Democracy is not doing what a majority want. Democracy is also, has three vital components: elections, which people trust and which leaders themselves respect, which Bolsonaro is already seeding doubts around, just as Trump did before him. Second, democracy is about the rule of law, and even the leaders being under the rule of law, which we've seen Trump, Bolsonaro trying to avoid. And third, democracy has to be about the protection of minorities. Because if it's not, it's just mob rule. And the protection of the minorities is the other thing which has been a victim of the Bolsonaro presidency, in my view. And this is really interesting to me as somebody who watches Brazil from a distance, who I'm sorry is so ignorant about Brazil, but right from watching unbelievably brave Brazilians fight against the dictatorship in Brazil and fight for democracy, Brazil has struck me as a magic country of people who have, in my lifetime, fought for a democracy, fought for institutions which support democracy, fought for those three things that I just called the essence of democracy. So it gives me real pain when I see those things under attack in this very new democracy, which is Brazil. On the positive side, what it looks from afar, and I'm just saying this because I'm asking you, because you're the experts, not me, but it looks from the very far distance that I look at Brazil as though one of the magical things that's happened over the last few years, while Bolsonaro was being president, is we've seen leadership at state level and at city level step up. We've seen a new resolve at lower state levels of government across Brazil and a new energy of very brilliant Brazilians like yourselves to go in and serve either at city level or at state level. And that strikes me as a very positive trajectory for Brazilian democracy. But educate me, please.
Thank you, Professor. Can we open the questions for the public? Please. Marta Rocha. Marta.
Boa tarde, vou pedir que você faça a tradução, que eu fico mais confiante em fazer a indagação em português. Primeiro, parabenizar pela oportunidade de estar aqui encerrando esse belo evento com essa análise sobre o Brasil. Mas eu queria fazer a pergunta exatamente para a nossa professora. E reparei que ela fez uma observação quanto ao que o Brasil, e fazendo essa dicotomia da violência, mas também do empenho do Brasil na legislação, né? Eu sou profissional da segurança pública, da polícia, e sou hoje deputada estadual e presidi uma comissão que apurou o feminicídio, a morte de mulheres no Rio de Janeiro. A cada 6 horas, uma mulher é morta no Brasil. Desculpa. Desculpa.
Okay.
Give me the headlines. Make sure I understood.
Okay. She's a state deputy in Brazil.
Yep.
She's asking about the violence.
Yep.
And okay. Understood. Okay. So.
E, apesar do Brasil ter experiências inovadoras como a Delegacia de Mulheres e a Lei Maria da Penha, que é considerada a 3ª melhor lei quando se trata de direitos humanos.
I know about the experiment with the women's police stations.
Yeah. And Lei Maria da Penha, it's a law in Brazil that increases the punishment. Okay, to men like a domestic violence. Okay, related to.
Mas ainda há uma invisibilidade das mulheres. E o que...
Desculpa. Pode repetir, por favor.
Apesar de tudo isso, há uma invisibilidade das mulheres no Brasil. Como se tudo isso não bastasse, o nosso presidente fez uma observação dizendo que teve 5 filhos. Na última vez ele errou e teve uma mulher. A pergunta é, como tirar as mulheres da invisibilidade, não apenas no cenário do mundo do crime, e como a senhora avalia a participação das mulheres na política, na produção de políticas públicas que possam fortalecer a cidadania feminina?
How to include women in the public policy, in the political arena and in the public policy, so they can really discuss gender and women visibility.
So it's a big question. It's a question for all of us. Let me just say, what stopped me dead in the Supreme Court judgment issued 2 days ago was that the majority of Supreme Court judges in the United States said that liberty, the liberty of the human being, should be interpreted according to the history and traditions of the United States, and that there was no history or tradition until the late 20th century of giving women rights to abortion. He didn't mention that he could have equally said that the tradition and history gave women no right to vote. It gave women no right to divorce. It gave women no protection from rape within marriage. It gave very little protection from any domestic violence. That's the historical tradition of ordered liberty which Alito and Thomas are telling us is their guide to the future. They describe it as ordered liberty. It's a liberty which, in the history they look at, only men actually benefited from. That's quite chilling for women across the world coming out of the United States Supreme Court, because we have, even those who disagree with Supreme Court justices in the past, nevertheless, this is one of the 3 core institutions of American democracy upon which we rely for the rule of law, for the protection of minorities, and for the sanctity of elections. And I think that's very, very chilling, because what happens in the United States, as you saw in Brazil with the election of Bolsonaro, creates a wind which travels to other countries. And I feel that at this moment, we need to look very, very closely at everything that has worked. And you're absolutely right. The experiments in Brazil with the special police stations for women, with the legislation, they have not worked as well as we hoped they would, but they have worked in some places. And I believe we've got to go out and look for what works and build on that now, because the forces in the opposite direction are quite strong.
Thank you. Sim. Alguém vai fazer a pergunta em inglês? Por favor. Pode ser ele de você de azul?
Yes, I actually would like to expand on this point, because I am someone who studies international relations in the US. And one point that I often make is exactly the fact that whether the US is conscious about it or not, whatever it does, whatever narratives prevail in the US, it ends up traveling to other places. So, as a Brazilian as well, I see Bolsonaro as a reflection of Trump, right? So I would like to hear a little bit about that role that the United States has as a country that gives legitimacy to certain narratives such as Bolsonaro and other policies that is against minorities. For instance, the decision of the Supreme Court is not only about women's rights, but LGBTQ community and other minorities, right? So this is indeed quite chilling. I would like to hear a little bit more about that topic and how can we counter that within the US somehow to prevent this wind from blowing to other places, if it makes sense.
To me, what's quite important is to think about the role that individual states play in this. Because another part of the Supreme Court judgment is the part of the judgment that says it should be up for states to decide this. And similarly in Brazil, I think there has been a stepping up at state level of government, although I'd love to hear if this is wrong or if you all think that that's correct. So I think we really have to take state level government very, very seriously, but also the consequences of politicizing the judiciary, the attorneys general, and the election officers. Because our democracies have relied on these institutions having a modicum of independence. And what we've seen in the United States is that independence collapse. And we've seen the judiciary highly politicized, the election officers now under huge pressure to be further politicized. So I think I like to look for where we can get better rather than to look at where the world's getting worse. And I think the place we can get better is at the state level. That's where we should be preparing defenses to the new onslaught of forces. Yeah.
Thank you. Gente, a próxima pergunta, se pudesse direcionar para o Miguel, para a gente fazer um equilíbrio entre as falas. A Gabi?
Miguel. I'll be brief. First, thank you very much. I'm Gabriela. Can you hear me now? Better. I'm Gabriela. I do development management at LSE, but sometimes I bother Miguel at the MPP. I have two different questions. The first one is for Miguel, which is actually not very original. Sorry? Okay, I'll do only one then. Sometimes I do those political stories on my Instagram, and an Italian guy, who's a friend of mine, asked me what would be the feasibility of having a Latin American political union a la a European Union. What do you think that would be the feasibility right now and the importance? Because like this whole forum was about developing the country. We cannot do this without alliances and partnerships. So what do you think?
Yeah, that's a tough one, but I think it's unlikely. And maybe I'm swimming against the emotional tide. It will be nice to have. I will be the first one. But I think it's hard because the European Union came as a response of a group of countries that realized that something had happened that they wanted to avoid and make a sort of an alliance that will make that event that happened extremely unlikely. So the peace was perceived to be above other means, and shared welfare was perceived to be above other means, and that facilitated the creation of the union that have withstood lots of crises. Latin American countries are dealing with too many challenges of their own. And as I said before, there are very opposing political currents in the region that make more likely the formation of blocs that will stand against other blocs, much more likely than the formation of a union. There might be a time for that. But I don't see, I mean, right now the region, it's moving a little bit, also mirroring the United States, where you sort of buy a package. You are right or left, and if you're right or left, if you're right, you buy a package, and that package is a series of tax consideration, religious consideration, social, so you need to buy it all. You buy this or you buy that. You buy the other one. And that actually takes room out of intelligence and criteria and rationality of what works and what doesn't. But the fact is that's where the region is at, and I see very unlikely. I think there are more likely to be unions of sub-blocks, which were attempted in the past, like UNASUR, and that sort of unions between people that share ideas. They might be the right or the wrong ideas, but they get together. Usually the ones with the wrong ideas get together faster than the ones with the good ideas. But I see more of a space for blocks. As a matter of fact, I'm not talking what I wish would observe. As a matter of fact, a space of blocks, and that's where Brazil becomes really important as a balancing power within the region.
I'm slightly more optimistic, actually, about this possibility, because for all emerging economies, there are now extraordinarily uncomfortable choices to be made. If the United States and Europe begin to say it's either us or it's China, but it's not both. It's either us or it's Russia, but it's not both. And there's an incomprehension in Washington about why so many countries, including Brazil, have not joined in the US position wholeheartedly on Ukraine, for example. Now, for emerging economies who want to not join either, but want to carve their own future, who are their allies going to be? In other words, if you're going to have to negotiate in a very tough way with China, with the United States, with Russia, and with the European Union, which is what Brazil now has to do you try and do that completely alone, or do you start actually grouping together with your regional partners? As I said, I know Brazil and Argentina are not best of friends all the time. I remember when I was in Brazil, Pope Francis had just visited Brazil, and all the Brazilians told me there were at least 2 miracles. And one, it was an Argentinian that Brazilians welcomed, and 2, a tourist spending a night on Ipanema Beach without having his wallet stolen. These were like the great miracles of Pope Francis's visit. But the Brazil-Argentina nuclear treaty which is a really deep treaty of mutual verification and monitoring, is an example of how that kind of cooperation can work. The Paraguay-Brazil negotiations on power, the efforts made on Mercosur to kind of create trade arrangements. If you go to the north of the continent and you look at the financial advantages of things like the CAF, of the Andean countries coming together to share their credit ratings, which gives them all a huge collective credit rating, which is much better. That's going to be really important as Brazil, Argentina, and every other country on the continent go into a debt crisis. So I think the pressures from outside, the political choices and the economic pressures will actually force some new partnerships to deepen.
Thank you. We still have time for one last question. Okay. Maybe you.
Muito boa tarde. Eu sou Federico Rivas, eu sou de El Salvador, estudante da diplomacia na Oxford. Os mesmos de sempre estão de volta. The usual suspects are back in Latin America, but not back as usual. We saw Kirchner rise again in Argentina. We may suspect Lula will rise again. But this past weekend also in Colombia, we saw with the victory of Gustavo Petro, the new left also brings the old left brings a new narrative. And with the vice president, Francia Marquez, being a champion in climate activism, we see that this is increasingly becoming a point of agenda for political parties around the world. And as Professor Woods was saying, how Brazil is at the center stage of climate, given the global necessity that the Amazon represents in climate conservation around the world. Do you see a rise in Brazil as climate? Do you think climate is going to lead the political agenda? Do you think that we have aspiring political leaders that will actually be elected, given that a lot of people in the bottom of the pyramid, even though they're aware of climate change, but the first necessities are around their personal security, their food security, and sometimes don't see the correlation of climate change with these other types of freedom?
Thank you so much for your question. Who would like to start? Maybe you, Professor Miguel?
I can say something about much better to talk about issues than to talk about old people coming back, because old people may have different ideas than the last time they came around. And those cases are interesting. Regarding climate, I think Brazil has made significant progress. It's a country in the region with the largest share of renewables in its energy mix. And I think that's a lot of progress. It started an experiment to deregulate the gas market, and it was very successful. Now the regulation needs to be extended to allow the market to take care of further environmental energy improvements. So I think Brazil is already ahead of many countries in the region. Now your question is there any point where this agenda overlaps, becomes against all the agendas that might be more relevant, like the agenda of food security, etc.? And I see that as an issue of leadership. That's not very different from agendas where you have a thing that you know needs to be done and another that people don't want to do even though they know that needs to be done. And the answer to that is it's leadership. It's not someone telling people what they want to hear, but telling them this is something that we need to do. It might be for the sake of the planet, of climate change. And it's not me, it's how do we organize together to get this done? Because if we want to transcend the level of we as a country have been for 40 years, we need to tackle these issues. And then your question about leadership becomes relevant because what's the leadership more likely to offer that sort of option to people? And that's how I like to think about what are the challenges a country is facing, and what's the leadership that it's more likely to help the country and bring the country together to tackle those challenges, and who's willing to tell people things that they might not like to hear, because some of these things are tough. You need to promise them something, of course. You cannot promise them only sweat, toils, and tears. You need to show them a place that it's better, But everybody that wanted to get to a better place at first found itself on a worse place. And it's difficult and it's hard at the beginning. And that's where leadership plays out. And I would just say, not to be very polemical, that I have a lot more hope with Brazil than with Colombia. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor.
So part of your question, Federico, was about the old left bringing a new narrative. And I mean, Brazil has already kind of led the world on that, right? When Fernando Henrique Cardoso was elected president, I was a student. I was reading this dependency theorist, you know, imagining world revolution. And then he comes to power and he just kind of gracefully inserts Brazil into the global economy, right? And then Lula comes to power and he's like the firebrand from the northeast, you know, and he's going to bring about a different kind of revolution. And then what does he do? He takes forward and ushers in this extraordinary period of growth, and each of them immediately capture the hearts and minds of global capital markets and kind of take Brazil into a global position. So Brazil's old left seems to me always to be bringing this rather new narrative. And I guess my question to the Brazilians in the room is, who is the new Cardoso or the new Lula? Maybe they're in this room. And what's their narrative going to be? Because I'm sure it's going to be a narrative which includes climate, and I'm longing to hear about it.
Thank you. Now we are running out of time, so I would like to invite you to the closing remarks. Is that okay?
Yes,
can you
absolutely.
Okay. Please, Professor Miguel.
Very fast. I just wanted to thank you all, to thank Leandro and the organization for the invite. It's my first time at Blavatnik School, so I'm really amazed and happy to be here today. The only thing that can help a country move forward, it's a group of people sitting together to address the real problems and the real challenges. That's the only thing. There's no other. And that's exactly what you have done here over 2 days. You have brought together a group of people from, I can hear from the questions, all sort of like professional crossroads. Some political scientists, some might be environmental economists, some other are working in public policy, some are working in diplomacy. There's no way to address a problem if you don't bring multiple perspectives. And I think the way you can bring specialization, because we live in a specialized world, and yet be able to keep the side of the forest and tackle problems is like bringing a group of people together. And I can see in the music beneath the words of your questions different political tendencies as well, which is also very important. And I also see a very diverse room from a gender standpoint, which I think it's also very important. So I come from a country that was lost. I think it's lost and will be lost for a number of years. And it's because it's lost. I like to think that things get lost because we don't organize on time to prevent them from getting lost. So when we started gathering to see what we could do, it was late. And that's not the case of Brazil. That's not the case of Brazil. So I think you're gathering on a great time. I think you have a chance of saying in the future, when you see Brazil in a different place, we were there. Remember when we met in Oxford? That's where we started working together. There we had this idea and went back home. And I think that's truly, truly hopeful. And that's the thing I appreciate the most in coming down here today. So thank you very much.
Yes, I think COVID and all the restrictions on us underlined just how incredibly important it is to come together, to eat together, to drink together, to laugh together, to make music together, to listen to music, to dance together, that these are things that human beings have done for thousands of years together that help human beings be much more than themselves, right? That build trust among groups of people, regardless of their view. And I just want to say that it's only when we come together and we build that trust that we can then create a space to dream of what Brazil can really be. You know, ad astra per aspera, which is, you know, you can reach the stars if you really set out to reach the stars. Or as others have heard me say before, human beings didn't reach the moon by saying, let's try and get quarter of the way, you know, and then turn around and come back, right? You've got to set your goals in a soaring way, and coming together in this fashion, I think, helps each of you to do that and to do it together collectively. It helps you also, as Miguel said, to form what in the school we keep calling unlikely coalitions, to form coalitions with people you might not have found yourself together dreaming dreams of in Brazil. And I think that's very, very special and powerful. That's how you build things that last. So really all I wanted to say is a huge congratulations to the students at the LSE and the students here in the Blavatnik School and in Oxford who came together and organized this conference in such an assiduous, fantastic way. They've clearly given you all an absolutely amazing opportunity. So I really just wanted to say what a joy it is to have such students in our midst, to support such students in our midst, and through their efforts to be hosting all of you here at the Blavatnik School. I hope you'll come and see us again soon. But a huge, please join me in thanking the amazing students that made this possible.
Thank you, professors. Bom, agora a gente vai para o encerramento. Bom, espero que vocês tenham aproveitado esses 2 dias de evento. Eu sei que eles foram super intensos, foram 2 dias extremamente cheios de discussão, né? Discussões super plurais. Eu acho que isso representa o que cada um desses 40 voluntários pensam, estudam. Nós tivemos um trabalho de quase 1 ano para colocar todas as ideias em prática que refletiram nesses 2 dias de evento. Foram muitas discussões, muito planejamento, muitos cálculos que nos trouxeram aqui hoje. E esse evento não seria possível sem 3 peças muito importantes. A primeira, que são os nossos parceiros que viabilizaram desde o café, o biscoito, o transporte dos painelistas. Então, eu gostaria de agradecer a Haddad Foundation, a Lehman Foundation, a Natura, o Instituto Ideia, o PGMBM, Matos Filho, Solaris e República pelo apoio e pela parceria. Também gostaria de agradecer aos nossos painelistas, que saíram de vários cantos do Brasil, enfrentaram horas de voo e filas de imigração. Obrigada. Eu gostaria de agradecer também aos nossos voluntários. Foram muitas horas. É super difícil conciliar um mestrado em inglês. E as milhões de reuniões que nós tivemos. A gente teve o desafio de pensar um evento presencial, depois de 2 anos de evento online. A gente queria muito compartilhar essa experiência com vocês, como a professora estava dizendo. A gente passou a valorizar mais o cheers, o almoçar junto, o jantar. O perrengue que a gente está passando de dividir acomodações de estudantes, da falta de hotel, da greve de trem. Acho que tudo isso nos une mais. Então, eu queria agradecer muito a força desses voluntários, às vezes que a gente teve que ser... Desculpa se às vezes eu fui mais rígida ou algo assim, mas eu agradeço muito o empenho de cada um de vocês. Sem vocês, isso não estaria acontecendo. Eu agradeço muito. E agora eu gostaria de chamar a Andresa, ela está ali. A Andresa, ela participou já de outras edições do Fórum e ela gostaria de falar as últimas palavras antes que a gente realmente concluísse o evento. Obrigada, Andresa.
Obrigada. Bom, na verdade, o que eu queria dizer para todos é que nesse momento, né, que o Brasil vive quase em guerra consigo mesmo e essa imposição de uma política quase barroca, né, do bem contra o mal, eu acho que o Brasil Fórum vem trazer uma nova arquitetura para o Brasil, né? Uma arquitetura onde é focada no diálogo, é focada na discussão, nessa solidariedade, né, de ouvir uns aos outros, de trazer essa possibilidade de discussão. E isso não é sem muito esforço, né? Eu acho que, como foi falado aqui, as reuniões intermináveis, eu já participei de uma das edições do Brasil Fórum de 2017, onde você se preocupa até se vai chover ou não, ainda pegaram uma greve de trens, e eu sei que é muito difícil. Então, eu queria convidar toda a organização para vir até aqui, para receber nossos aplausos de pé. Eu acho que a Naira falou muito bem, que esses alunos todos da LSI aqui de Oxford, da Blavatnik, estão muito de parabéns, que vieram de toda a Inglaterra, na verdade. Gente, por favor, recebam todo o aplauso que temos para vocês. Por favor, venham. Eu vou dar a volta e vou tirar fotos. Tá.
Stay there. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.